and Dr. Fatma Abdallah for their presentation, which is on leveraging the Kenyan diaspora in climate change action for sustainable development.
Good morning. I hope you can hear me. Thank you. Our presentation is entitled, as has been echoed, on leveraging the Kenyan diaspora in climate change action for sustainable development. And it is basically guided by the government efforts in mainstreaming the diaspora in the country's development. And it's a build-up to the current existing literature on climate change and development. And we have a number of studies that have been undertaken in this regard. For instance, we have a study that was taken in year 2014 by German Watch and the African Diaspora Policy Center, which also focused on climate change, development, and migration from an African diaspora lens. So basically, our presentation is five-pronged. It is structured on 5 sections, and the first section begins with providing an overview of the Kenyan diaspora in terms of their demographic and geographical distributions and the skill set and also their expertise. And then this will be followed by a synoptical overview of climate change and its impact in Kenya in view of the number of also strategies that have been laid upon in tapping the diaspora knowledge and expertise in climate change, and also in view of their role as climate ambassadors. So and also remittances. So the presentation will also highlight the motivations and challenges and conclude with the policy recommendations and way forward. So having said this, I now leave the floor to my senior and co-presenter, Ambassador Kikaya, to proceed with the presentation. Thank you. I submit.
Thank you, Fatma. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Excellencies, all protocol observed. Can you hear me? Hello?
Hello, yes, we can hear you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, good. I am actually in the diaspora now, but if you can hear me, I'll appreciate it. So just like my colleague Fatma has said, very little attention has been paid to diaspora over the years, especially in Africa. And it is high time that we acknowledge that they are playing a very significant role in our life. If you look at reports emanating from all academic research areas, you'll discover that remittances, specifically from the diaspora, are very, very significant. And this was brought home much more importantly when we had the COVID pandemics. The so-called global south is recorded to have remitted annually, even over that period, that amounts the tune of $590 billion every year, even throughout that period. Now, this compares very poorly with what we normally refer to as official development assistance, which only came in with 180 billion. But also, if you add that to the philanthropic or charity-related organizations with 70 billion, and private capital, then which really diminished to just a mere $400 million. What does that mean? This means that ODA actually went down by 1%. Philanthropy also went down by 1%. Private capital was completely wiped out. people didn't want to risk their investment, and this is likely to be the trend, especially where you have turbulence like the conflicts that we have in Africa. But surprisingly, diaspora remittances actually rose by 19%. And this should be understood in the context of what my colleague Fatima has said, the motivation. What are the motivating factors of such remittances? Because people in the diaspora realized that their kids and kin were facing dire conditions. COVID is not something that, especially us in Africa, had experienced, at least not in the recent past, and therefore didn't know how to deal with it, and therefore how to go about sustenance. So the fact that the people in the diaspora were encouraged to do this to that tune means there is that potential, which when we are talking about climate change, we can only be to our disadvantage if we don't dig into it. Coming specifically to Kenya, and I'm cognizant of the fact that we only have 10 minutes to split between us. When you come to Kenya, which is something that we can say that is quite commendable. Those of us who have been in that government's foreign policy formulation, and I'm glad you have Mr. Juma with you there, amongst others, we looked at diaspora, and I can say with the pride that now the Kenyan government has included in their foreign policy diaspora as an integral part of our foreign policy dissemination. Why? It's because if you bore a leaf, especially from the Asian and sub-Asian areas like countries like Philippines, Indonesia, they acknowledged this a lot long before us and included them even in their missions in the embassies with specific officers dealing and addressing issues of their diaspora. As a result, they were encouraged to increase their remittances to their countries without the kind of impediments that we in Kenya experienced for a long time. So what is the framework under which we can rely on diaspora to alleviate climate change? First of all, the Kenya government put into place an act, the Climate Change Act of 2016, and that in itself contextualized the government's commitment to climate change. But it did not end there, and this is where now I want you to accompany me in the context of diaspora. An enabling action plan, which is called the National Climate Change Action Plan of 2018 to 2022, clearly defined what are the specific areas that we need to be looking at when you talk about climate change. You cannot just be talking about climate change without having targets that we need to tackle in our respective specialized areas. For example, the area of adaptation. In the area of adaptation, it meant that things cannot be as usual. We have to change even our lifestyles according to how we can mitigate climate. Afforestation, and this is a clarion call that the Kenyan government has had for a long time. Reforestation, landscape restoration, climate smart agriculture, geothermal and clean energy development. I was glad to hear from our colleague from Israel put it very, very clearly. And really we should be embarrassed when he does say so, that we have this free sun that comes, and fortunately for Kenya, very regularly, except of course in the periods of July, August that we've just passed through. And yet, what do we do with it? And how can we encourage our diaspora when and if they're making remittances that are investing in this kind of areas. Clean energy development, energy efficiency, even mechanization, and then drought-resistant crops, even grasses for our people who are the herdsmen in the semi-arid areas. Now, let me just repeat here that when we are looking at the diaspora, these are people who perhaps have been out of the country for some time and would need a lot of guidance, especially in the area of investment. My clarion call would be that the diaspora office in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs perhaps should go beyond just providing diplomatic protection to their nationals, to having a channel of communicating to them and with them on areas that they can contribute directly in order to mitigate the problem of climate change. Excuse me to just rush through. We provided the slides which members can look through at a later time. There are areas like the challenges that we face when we are dealing with climate change. For example, a limited coordination. To what extent have we given the people in the diaspora information enough for them to be able to tap in the various categories of because by aligning this to our policy, it is now where we can also tap in the wealth and the skills of our diaspora who have been exposed to how other countries have done it outside there, and therefore replicate best practices locally. Resource allocation, I can't belabor at that point, but the area of sustainability and capacity building is also an area that diaspora can contribute greatly. We have made some policy recommendations there in terms of involving the diaspora, which colleagues can be able to look at. For example, we talk about diaspora engagement. When we have, for instance, soon Kenya will be hosting the climate change conference. I think it is important for us to avail, if there are any virtual sessions, that those of our nationals who are in the diaspora can tune in and therefore be able to be in tune with what is happening locally. Cultural sensitivity, I was glad to see that going on right now, the Ma community are showcasing their cultural heritage. And the interesting thing is that they have even come all the way from Tanzania and across the board into Kenya. Again, what is it that they are saying?
Ambassador,
teaching their people?
You may have your final comments. Final comments, please, because of time. Final comments.
Okay, my final comment then would be that I'll just go to the conclusion where we say the Kenyan diaspora holds immense potential to drive climate action for sustainable development in Kenya. 2, by harnessing their knowledge, expertise, resources, and expansive networks, cultural influence, diaspora members can very significantly contribute to mitigating the adverse effects or the impact of climate change and promoting a greater and more resilient future for Kenya overall. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Let us give him a round of applause. So he has given us a very good idea in terms of the potential is available. What we need to do is to harvest it. Thank you very much, Ambassador. The next presenter will be Njoki. Njoki is going to present on amicable boundary delimitations as a tool for implementation of climate action plans for sustainable development in Eastern Africa. So Njoki, you have 10 minutes, and I will now be very bullet-driven in terms of looking at time. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I assure you, I will shoot back in the 10 minutes. I will adopt the protocol that was laid this morning and just add by saying good morning. Good morning. Is it because we are way past tea time? Anyway, if we could just put up my slides. My slides, please. Thank you very much. As they're working on that, I decided to speak about amicable boundary delimitation as a tool for implementation of climate change action plans for sustainable development in Eastern Africa. And as we go along, I hope you will see why that is the topic that I picked. I will just very quickly look at about 5 aspects. The first thing will just to lay the content out there as I'm doing right now. Second is to ask ourselves, as I know we already appreciate the issue really of what the amicable boundary delimitation is all about, again, towards appreciating why I chose this topic. I will then share with you the assumption that drove this presentation. Then just to ask ourselves, having had that examination of the assumption, or even as we go along, how can amicable boundary delimitation serve as a tool for implementation of action plans for sustainable development in Eastern Africa, which then lays the basis for the discussion today. I will then just briefly make reference to something that we can borrow from the business world as we move forward. Then we can conclude and perhaps make 2 or 3 recommendations. I need to confirm that I did submit my slides before the presentations were made this morning by the presenters, so that, so that you'll find, interestingly, there's quite a lot of convergence when you look at the conversations that were made and the presentation that I'll make. This therefore means that the discussion is not alien. Perhaps it is a question of, as Professor William asked this morning, it's a question of asking ourselves, how do we then implement whatever recommendations we are making going forward? So, of course, we know that when you talk about the question of amicable boundary delimitation, we are talking about the process itself as well as the outcome that then helps in dealing with overlapping or disputed territorial boundary concerns. The thing that you will see, and I intend to ride on it, is the issue of diplomacy and the legal process of maritime boundary delimitation. This presentation is that we consider, or that then we would want to implement in an efficacious manner, will require accurate and up-to-date data, including on the trends, climate trends, and impacts. And this, of course, is within the land space as well as within the maritime boundary space, or within the maritime space. And that when countries cooperate on boundary delimitation, and we don't have disputes as we have with the Kenya-Somali maritime boundary dispute, or the problem that we're having with respect to Lake Victoria and the various countries, when those issues are resolved, then, and or when they're being addressed in a manner that is amicable, you find that then information is shared in a manner that is useful and that cuts across, and therefore helps in modeling various interventions as well as risk assessment and also planning. The other aspect is with respect to disaster risk reduction, and again, it just relates to the data sharing, the example that I have given on data sharing. Just to say that when countries have a shared understanding of their borders, they can then be able to work together in a manner that helps them reduce the various challenges and just be able to also respond to climate-related disasters. The other aspect that I looked at is the question of international, just the need for international cooperation, and again, just looking at the question of climate change as a global problem that transcends boundaries and therefore requiring international or global interventions. And so when we are looking at the question of maritime boundaries or land boundaries, they are international or transnational in nature. And there is therefore need to enhance the ability of Eastern African countries to engage in regional and international climate change negotiations. Of course, we've done this, and we continue to do this, as Ambassador has alluded to. The problem is, as a leader in the region, I know I have 2 minutes. As a leader in the region, if we don't, if we're not promoting peace, or we are not at the forefront of it in terms of dealing with maritime boundary disputes or land boundary disputes, then we lose the moral ground. We lose the people. We cannot move with the other countries in the region. What then, as a way forward, I'm proposing is that, as a way forward, we could consider a business approach. We know what has happened to Kodak. As we were growing up, we were told every moment became a Kodak moment, isn't it? But now, where is Kodak? We have phones, we have moved on to other areas. So even as we look at climate change, it is important that, as Coca-Cola has been able to successfully do, we go beyond the traditional perceptions or the traditional approaches. And that is why, for me, I am suggesting that one of the non-traditional approaches to addressing climate change challenges is by considering the prioritization of amicable boundary delimitation, and not just that we enhance awareness of this priority area, and that is why you have that circular illustration there, because if we have limited awareness, then we will have limited public support, which then will contribute to stalled learning, and we will therefore lack implementation goodwill. In conclusion, therefore, we need to ditch individualism at the various sectors. We also need to deliberately prioritize amicable boundary delimitation as a tool for implementation of climate action plans for sustainable development in Africa. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Harriet. Let us give a big applause. Thank you very much. Okay, so we are moving the presenter for the next climate change negotiations is yet to arrive. Is Mercy Odongo here? Mercy? Okay, so if Mercy is not there, then we move to... Oh, okay, sorry for that. So Mercy is going to make a presentation on climate change negotiations and the future of multilateral diplomacy. So, Mercy, you can proceed.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen? Okay. In the practice of statecraft, given that I've been given only 10 minutes, states deploy a number of tools to advance their foreign policy agenda. One of them is diplomacy, military, economics, intelligence, and they use various means that deploy either soft power, hard power, or smart power. So in the context of climate change negotiation process, it is important that we understand the context of the negotiation process, that climate change is a complex process where different actors evolve, they change, they resist change, take initiative at different times. Number two, the ecology of the environmental problem poses a unique challenge because of the transboundary nature. Three, the complexity of environment and the intersection with other issues such as development, security, governance, technology, feminism, among other things as well. Then the environment is a multifaceted issue that brings in the aspect of global warming, sustainable development, biodiversity, food sovereignty, that demands both global perspectives and local actions. So given this, the climate change negotiation process is anchored on UN General Assembly Resolution 45/2012 in the 1990. And why this is important is it set the parameters that laid the foundation for the convention framework, the architecture, and the process. So in that case, it is a 4-step process where there's a conventional protocol approach with established institutional framework, followed by a commitment to address the problem, and then consensus in a decision-making process. How is that important? It's important because we have seen since that process that there have been 3 shifts in the negotiation process in the climate change. Number one, there was a departure from the legally binding emissions targets for the industrial countries under the Kyoto Protocol to a voluntary contribution in the form of NDCs under the Paris Agreement. That was a major shift. The second one is the emergence of a hybrid Paris Agreement, displacing the top-down Kyoto architecture and now bringing that bottom-up Paris Agreement. Then the third shift is the addition of adaptation and finance under the Paris Agreement in the initial Kyoto focus on mitigation. So those becomes critical. Then in terms of the process of climate change negotiation has taken close to 3 decades, because now from COP1, we are now going to COP28 in Dubai this year in November. The negotiation occurs within a multilateral negotiation framework involving many actors. They have issues, interests, but under a multi-pronged approach, both formal and informal. So that becomes critical now when we are looking at what is the future of multilateral diplomacy. Having taken the origin, the architecture, the process, and the shifts, then we are looking at multilateral diplomacy in the climate change over the years. They have failed to reach consensus on a framework to tackle climate change. And why is that important is because of lack of political will and enforcement mechanism and diverse interest among the various actors, which becomes a major obstacle in the implementation of the agreements. So reviews of the international climate negotiation from the early 90s onward shows that a global deal strategy has been successful in driving the international process forward. That is creating the political momentum behind that global climate protection. But this is not enough. So if you look at the context of the Kyoto Protocol, they used what I would call the building block strategy. Building block strategy is where you, because of the different ideologies and bias considerations, you take the developing nations, you give them the first commitment as you do a staggered approach for the developing nations. This, to some extent, experienced a challenge in the implementation as the second commitment period after 2012 became almost impossible for countries that were reluctant to set targets, but others also withdrew completely, like Canada and in the case of Japan and Russia. So in employing a building block strategy, the Kyoto Protocol avoided what we call a universal approach in the initial emission targets for the period 2008 and 2012 that was applied to developed nations. Then what I'm proposing as a way forward is a combination of 2 things: the global deal strategy that brings everyone on board, but employing what I'm calling the 3D negotiation framework. So this 3D negotiation framework talks about having 3 dimensions in the negotiation process, where you have the tactics, the deal design, and the setups, all operating concurrently for you to achieve the results. And when you're applying the 3D model, there are three tensions again that you must be able to hold concurrently. What I mean by this tension, for example, the tension number one in applying the deal design, the setups, and the tactics in the negotiation process, there'll be the tension between creating of value and distributing this value. So that is where we talk about either dividing the pie or expanding the pie. In the context of now national interest with the various complexities, then you're able to determine how do I deal with that issue of distributing value and targeting the opportunities that need to claim the values. The second tension is the idea of showing empathy and assertiveness. How do you explain your interests with your negotiators in a way that takes care of how they perceive their interests without losing your own interest? Empathy versus assertiveness. Then the third aspect is the issue of the agents and the people who are at the table behind the scenes. So in the people who find themselves in negotiating table represent different ideologies, different interests, have a following, and all these people, you must take care of their interests when you are negotiating. So these three tensions, when you hold them together, using the setups, the tactics, and the deal design, then you are able to be comprehensive in your movement of the process forward. And then in the context of the 3D model, sometimes because of the human nature that we experience, we are not able to objectively look at this because there are three tensions, as you also have the national interest at hand. You're using as the complexity of the decision-making process, the negotiation process, the multiplicity of actors within a play. So then the proposal is you need a support or an AI mechanism that will help augment or support you. And this will also be pegged on in the negotiation process where are the decisions structured? If they're structured, can they be repetitive? If they're not unstructured, are they able to be descriptive or declarative? Based on the various kinds of decision-making process, you'll be able to apply either predictive analytics or you're able to forecasting in a way that will be able to deal with things that you cannot be able to see objectively with the human lens. So in the context of East Africa, for example, you'll find we have, in the African Union context of groupings, you'll have almost like 15 African countries. And these African countries are diverse. You'll find small island states like Comoros, Mauritius, Seychelles in the same group. With the East African countries, 7 of them, Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, name it. Then you find also landlocked countries and countries that have access to the water resource. And then you'll find developing and developing countries. You'll find multiple membership to RECs or regional economic cooperation. So when you are dealing with this kind of thing, then you have to factor in what are the various issues, what are their points of perspectives, what are their positions on various issues, what are the alternatives, deal or no deal options, what are their best alternative to a negotiated agreement, what are their reservation values, what are their zone of possible agreement. All these are essential. And in conclusion, because of the few minutes that we have, maybe I'll be open to questions. There is need for a negotiation strategy in climate governance that use 3D model in a global strategy context with the support of AI. So future research could explore how artificial intelligence tools could help in analyzing different physical situations such as attitudes, moods, sentiments, feelings, amongst others. So the paper recommends a strategic rethink on how to advance global climate protection in the current political and economic environment. I thank you and I wait for your comments.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mercy. Let us applaud Mercy again. Thank you. And so she has mentioned that there's a deadlock at the multilateral level, and she has given us proposals for way forward. So we'll interrogate that as we move forward. The next presenter would be Rodolphe Saddam, who is going to make a presentation on does the Kenyan National Development Plan engage the Kenyan diaspora in climate change action? So welcome to the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed participants, distinguished guests, all protocols observed, good morning. My name is Rauda Seda Saddam. It is with great pleasure and deep sense of purpose I thank the organizing committee for giving me an opportunity to address you here. Today, I hope to add some insight to an issue that transcends geopolitical boundaries and touches the very essence of our shared humanity, the involvement of the diaspora in climate change action. Climate change is among the most salient challenges facing the globe today. I acknowledge that Kenya and our region, Eastern Africa, is exceptionally vulnerable to impacts of climate change. For a developing country like Kenya, with an economy highly dependent on the natural resource base, climate change has meant that the quality of life for many Kenyans is also adversely affected by climate change. Currently, with a population of 53 million people, give or take, 28 million lack access to safe water. Climate change continues to add strain on already scarce resources. 4.4 million people are facing high levels of acute food insecurity as of the start of this year, and that number is projected to rise to 5.4 million. Right now, forced migration due to drought has led to a drop of the number of births supported by health facilities in the northern part of Kenya, from 411 births supported by health facilities to 100 in a month. Refugee camps such as Dadaab have noted an increase in the number of arrivals attributed to the prolonged drought, flash flooding in the region, all of which is alarming. When we look at these different impacts of climate change on the different aspects of the quality of life within Kenya, this means that climate change is a threat to development. On my presentation, I have highlighted different definitions of development from different scholars over time. Development is a term that has been defined and redefined throughout human history. As I'm sure we'll hear more about this tomorrow, I will only highlight these few definitions. The reason I put these various understandings of development is so that we can understand how the different ideas have led us to what we term as sustainable development today. The definition I want to bring to our attention is one that was promoted in the Rumbert report in 1987 that says, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I highlight this document because it helped popularize the concept of sustainable development, but it also best captures the spirit of Kenya's National Development Plan, especially when you view the second pillar of this plan, just, cohesive, and equitable social development and a clean, secure environment. And this is where the diaspora comes into play. There are various definitions according to different institutions on who is a part of the diaspora, whether this is just from an international perspective, from the regional perspective of Africa, and from the Kenyan perspective. The diaspora has been somewhat decisive within international policy. Some view the diaspora as an aspect of brain drain, while others view the diaspora in terms of brain circulation. Both of these ideas are captured within Kenya's Diplomacy Act of 2014. The diaspora, often considered a bridge between homelands and adopted countries, poses a unique power to contribute to the collective efforts aimed at mitigating challenges posed by a changing climate. The potential for knowledge exchange, capacity building, technology transfer, and resource mobilization is pivotal in shaping climate change action plans for sustainable development. Fortunately, in the same breath that Kenya and the region is vulnerable, we are also a reservoir of untapped potential and innovations. With an estimated 3 million people making up the Kenyan diaspora, in 2020, the Central Bank of Kenya reported an estimated of 350 billion Kenya shillings, which was remitted. This surpassed tourism and exports as Kenya's leading revenue earner. Of course, we have to take into consideration that at the time we were battling with the COVID-19 pandemic. The World Bank estimates that by November 2022, Kenya received 503 billion Kenya shillings and ranked Kenya as the top third earner in Africa from diaspora remittances. And then in 2015, it was estimated that from 16% of the US-based migrants, 16% of them possessed master's, PhD, or advanced degree. And this is compared to the 20% of the US population in total. As you can see, the diaspora is one that has rich potential. Unfortunately, it is not clear where the diaspora comes in, especially in terms of policy in climate change. It is true that the National Development Plan offers us a clear pathway to achieve low carbon climate resilient development and mainstreaming of climate change. However, the following frameworks do not show us clearly where the diaspora would then step into these ways forward. For instance, the Kenya National Adaptation Plan 2015-2030 highlights the roles of, for instance, the private sector, the public, different government agencies, but the diaspora have not been given their own role. While the Kenya Diaspora Policy of 2014 is comprehensive and does a good job of thoroughly outlining the means by which the diaspora can aid development through investments and other economic activities, it still does not touch on their role within climate change. While this may seem unsettling, it does not mean that we have lost our opportunity to harness the diaspora. Throughout the course of my research, I came upon a strong community, members of the Kenyan and African diaspora, who felt passionately and strongly that they have a role to play in climate change action. I was lucky enough to sit through a webinar where scholars, practitioners, and environmentalists were discussing the Save Lamu project. They discussed the importance of preserving our ecosystems in Kenya and how we can find sustainable alternative means of development, especially for indigenous communities. Evidently, there is goodwill and passion for then the global mobilization towards positively impacting our environment for the sake of future generations. Our policies and development plans must follow suit. The diaspora offers unique perspectives and experiences. Their transnational connections enable a broader understanding of global issues, and they enhance policy implementation. By engaging the diaspora in climate change action, we tap into a wellspring of commitment and passion. Together, we can forge a future where the strength of our global community converges to address the pressing challenges of our time and forge sustainable legacy for generations to come. But I insist that policy must lead this action. And why is that? Because policy not only offers us clarity, direction, accountability, efficiency and effectiveness, predictability and stability, coordination and consistency, and long-term vision, which is something we need in order to be able to tackle an issue such as climate change. There is hope. For instance, the diaspora plan as of December 2022 is going to be reviewed. So we still have a chance to look at these policies and determine what are the areas we haven't really invested in and how can we express ourselves a lot better in engaging this pool of people and the wealth of knowledge that they can offer us. Thank you so much for lending me your ear.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let us applaud Saddam again. So the fundamental issue is policy. Yeah, so that marks the end of the presentation at this time. I'm going to invite Professor Macharia Munene. Or can I have the presenters rise to the high table? Those who are in the lower table now have approved your mobility. So I'm going to invite Professor Macharia Munene to run us through Professor Macharia Munene is a renowned scholar, a walking historical material, and a thinker who is deep in his thoughts. So when Prof comes here, my words will be validated. So Professor, wherever you are, I upgrade you to come to the podium. Yes, Professor.
Thank you. Professor Jonyo has a way of putting things. Mine is to reflect on what has been said or what they tried to say. So some commentaries. First, I think all the presentations were very good. They were provocative, they were enlightening, and they were timely for the mission ahead. I grouped them into two categories, not in the order of the presentation, but in emphasis. So there are two presentations that really were talking about the diaspora, the Kenyan diaspora. That's all they were talking about. And then you have two others that appear to deal with practical challenges relating to international boundary, that's Njoki's, or ability to negotiate in multilateral settings. So they were good in that sense. The one missing aspect in all of them, I don't know whether it is by constraints, design, or desire, they failed to address the place of political dynamics, on politics, siasa, whether that is domestic politics or global politics, and how it affects climate change to deal with. So that because whatever one thinks or likes and does not like, you cannot avoid politics. And we've seen a lot of things passing or failing because of political dynamics, not because of the policy. So they need to look into that. So the dynamics of politics, the challenges they pose both in terms of policy making and implementation. And the two are not one and the same. Sometimes we get very good policy documents which end up in the shelves gathering dust, partly because the implementer is not in tune with the policymaker. So they all may need to look into that. So the absence of this reality makes the presentations sound abstract. This, then you say, and how are you going to do that? And who is going to do it? And then we get stuck. So each of the presenters can find ways of factoring in the effect of political dynamics in the success or failure of incorporating the diaspora or the boundary management or negotiating issues of climate change with the related interests as the countries involved are busy pushing their interest. Now, the first presentation by Kikaya and Abdulatif, Geopolitics of Climate Change in East Africa. The title is East Africa, but it was all about Kenya. So it's about Kenya, 3 million of them out there So you look at it, what is the issue here? It's an attitude issue. For both policymakers and the people in the diaspora. And I think Saddam alluded to, towards the end, the question of policymakers. How do they address the diaspora? It's one thing to have an office of the diaspora with some officials who occasionally go there to say hi and then come back. So the hanging question in their presentation is one of energizing the diaspora in order to take interest in warding off climate disaster in Kenya. And maybe the way to do that is to show the connection between the big climate change talk and the individual family members. That your mother, uncle, brother, little sister, or whatever it is, in that little village over there are going to disappear, or something is going to happen to your homestead. So direct connection, so that somebody feels it. The way we are talking is abstract. But how do we make people see the connection and then want to do something about it? And those in the diaspora who appear to have the capacity to do something should be challenged to take it personally and then do what may need to do. At present, what we have is that we have people in the diaspora. They are very good in advancing concrete jungles, not so much planting trees or plants. So how do we change that mind frame? And it's good that there are few people that Saddam met, but the majority of them may need some reorientation. It brings me to Saddam. I think she spent quite a bit of time trying to discuss the arguments about development, which is really an ideological issue. And look at Rostow, W.W. Rostow. What was he doing? Just an ambitious academic who wanted to make a name by looking as if he can challenge Karl Marx for the following of people in the third world. Said, if you want to be developed like us, this is what you have to do. It's an ideological thing. And yes, it was challenged later by those dependency people. Talked about core, periphery, and all those kind of things. That what you are telling us is nonsense, because this is the issue. So the question that I think the UN tried to address later was to go beyond the ideological argumentations or disputes between Rostow and his followers, and then those people in Latin America, the dependency people afterwards. So the question is, how successful has this effort succeeded in going beyond the ideological dispute? And what role has the diaspora played, or it can play, to advance the sustainable development goals? In reality, I think that's what the UN was trying to do. Go beyond these arguments into something more serious. So how successful has that been, Saddam? And the diaspora, apart from the ones you met, a few of them, how serious are they on the issue of climate change? Since it was a small engagement, maybe it's a challenge to go and see whether you can meet a few more people and see whether they will have the same thing. So the good thing to talk about the enhanced role of the diaspora, that they are taking interest, is very good. And yes, they can do something. And they should be encouraged to do something. And they can be encouraged to do that by being shown that it is in their personal interest. Their mother or their father is in danger because of this. And some of them have a little money to spare for that. My friend in Njoki, the boundaries. It's a good idea about problems in on the borders. And then you have these people who are policy makers talking big about how to solve things. So they mismanage. I think your message is that the boundaries are mismanaged. And we have all these officials in every country, ministries, and people in the ministries, some of them experts, others pretending to be experts. And they're supposed to deal with a very complex issue, and some of them may not even know what they are doing. I don't know whether, Njoki, you've come across that. In part because they are there because of who they know. It's crony thing, rather than what? Seriousness. So is it possible to get the countries concerned in this border issue to become a little more serious and not just to make nice statements, which the media love to repeat. But when you dig deep, why is it not working? Probably the wrong people have been sent to deal with this issue. People who have no interest from the people who are there because somebody wants them there. Not so much to deal with the challenge, but to occupy some space. And to deny somebody else the chance to occupy that space. And that's what I was talking about, the politics things. And I'm sure each person here knows instances like that. And then when that happens, no solution comes because the wrong people are there. So do the countries concerned realize that they are failures to do it right, discussing climate change seriously? That their failures are destroying each one of them, as opposed to those others out there. So my friend Njoki, what are the intentions of the managers, the boundary managers, from each side towards each other? What do they think of the other guy? And does that affect the ability to manage the boundaries? If I may add a little bit, those intentions, suppose some of them have irredentist ambitions. We know occasionally Ethiopia dreams of getting a corridor to the Indian Ocean. It's landlocked. Can you ignore those intentions? Anyway, that's a different matter altogether. Mercy. Negotiations. Good idea. The negotiation is a tool, an instrument of statecraft. It's true. It's a good notion. The question is, how well prepared are these so-called negotiators when they go to confront their counterparts on the other side? And are they on the same wavelength? Or are they simply good buddies of somebody? So they go there because they are buddies. knowing what they are going to talk about. They make the mistake of not being ready while the other side is better prepared. Because in these negotiations or discussions, one the critical requirement is good knowledge of the other side. Because without knowledge of the other side, you are wasting your time. And when the other side knows more about you than you know about yourself, then you're in danger. You're just doing nothing. So, mercy, how true is this? The challenge. Do the negotiators understand climate change itself, the notion and the practice that was going on? So if they don't understand climate change as a phenomenon, are they in position to engage in negotiations competently? Are they likely to negotiate core interests or primary interests and give it away to the other side, and in return they get secondary or some crumbs, which happens a lot. Are they of the same mind? The negotiators on each side, are they on the same side? Not the same side, but the same mind. The same mind frame. Or is different. There are some who are busy trying to figure out how to fix the others to it. And the others are innocent lambs to be slaughtered at the negotiating table. There is talk of stalemate. But it would be good to know exactly how this stalemate comes up. I have the advantage of having seen the abstract. So I can say that. Exactly what is this stalemate? And what does it entail? And why is it there? So that it needs unblocking. Then in general, there are these comments about what needs to be done. Action. Do this, do that, do that. Who is going to do that? Is it state officials? Is this some government top-notch fellow somewhere who may not have interest anyway? Is it some people who are serious? Exactly, who is to do this? And when you compare the various countries, they all say the same thing, but they fail to do it. Is it because the people in charge with the responsibility of doing, implementing, do not believe in the thing anyway? Yet, they are the ones charged with the responsibility. So as I conclude my comments, I think somebody called White some time ago wrote an article, The Tragedy of the Commons. And climate change is a tragedy of the commons. It is everybody's problem, and therefore nobody's responsibility to deal with it. Because you are waiting for somebody else to, or you are waiting for the government, which is amorphous and sometimes confused, to do it. So who then gets to do it? Although you are saying something should be done, without saying who is to do it. It boils down to being an attitude problem. Not just for the government and the states, but it is an attitude problem for each individual, that these things are realities. Those in Kenya, some of us remember, when we knew that the rains would start on this day. And they did, And you planted, and And we knew that certain things will happen on this day. Now it does not happen. So can we do something to reverse those things? There's need to link beautiful policy proposals and the clear sense of urgency that is evident. Link that to the reality of implementation or neglect and apathy. So maybe when there is that big conference in September, we address this, the reality of beautiful policies and the apathy or neglect when it comes to implementation. In part because it's not clear who's going to do it. So facing the internal contradiction in each person and in the states between the ideals of combating climate change as policy on one side and the individual desires to advance specific interests that might be in conflict with the general desire. So we may need to address that, whether we like it or not. The people we entrust with these things are conflicted and therefore have a problem addressing. There is a professor called Jesse Mugambi. He used to teach religion at the University of Nairobi. But he has an interesting idea, which is individualistic rather than communal. So most of us here do have a small compound where we live. Maybe it's 1/8 of an acre, or 1/16, or 1 acre, or 10. So if each person was to plant some sort of a plant in each corner of the compound, and then the neighbor does the same thing, within a short time, it becomes an individual endeavor. And because each person is planting one plant at the corner, each corner of your compound, within some time you are likely to have a forest image, if everybody did that. And then there are benefits to the individual because you can plant those fruit trees and you eat them. And they also provide good shade. In those areas that are semi-arid or desert, it can change. I have seen it. Some places that used to be arid desert, they used not to rain. Nowadays, it rains when it rains. And I see Dr. Handa there. You can attest to that at Kahasukari. Yeah? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I cautioned you, so you have seen deep thinking. And I didn't want to disrupt Prof, because a person of this magnitude, should you dare disrupt them, I don't want academic curse. All right. So thank you very much, Prof. Thank you very much. So I think in the interest of time, we have two presenters in person and we have two virtual. I stand guided. I think maybe Dr. Sembo, we may take very few questions, if you allow. Maybe two. Yes, two have been guided, and that is legitimacy. We are going to take two questions. Other discussions can go on. So when you are raising your question, direct it to any of them, or if you want any to respond, I would appreciate. And without public participation, I'll have one lady and one gentleman. Yes, madam.
Thank you very much, our dear moderator and your presenters. I want to appreciate not just your presentation, but your ages. We talked about the matter of climate change and environmental sustainability now becoming a transgenerational matter. So we appreciate the younger generation and what they are doing. Two comments. I can't remember the name of the presenter on negotiations. You will identify yourself. Mercy. I listened very carefully. You have very good ideas about that. But I wish that you could make some maybe recommendation on how better to prepare as a country, as a region, for negotiations at that table that matters. Because I think even the professor who has raised concerns has wondered whether we have the right ones, whether they are prepared, maybe some recommendations, even if not here in your final paper. Then the other one was the presenter on, this was the diaspora. Very, very interesting subject. I think it's Professor Kikaya and the partner. I wondered, diaspora, many of the people that left our countries, for example, have left because of a problem. Maybe a very large proportion are actually non-official in the countries they live now. And so I'm just wondering, how really can we tap into that population? Or don't you think this is an area that probably we need to research on? Are they willing, first of all, to do disclosures and all these things? And then how best to engage them in climate change matters? Thank you.
You can go on.
Thank you, moderator. Western Shilao here. Thank you, Saddam and Njoki. Saddam, I begin with your presentation. You share with us quite fascinating statistics. 4.1 billion Kenya shillings sent back home by Kenyans in the diaspora in form of remittances. Kenya's diaspora population form the top third largest earner in Africa as far as remittances are concerned. 15% of the diaspora in the US have got a master's degree.
I think just ask a question. Don't make another presentation.
Okay.
Just ask directly, please.
I'm laying the foundation compared to 20% of the US population. Joki, that sets me into thinking that, or rather, Saddam, what would we gain if these people are in Kenya or in Nigeria or in Uganda? Compare the amount of money they have sent that the World Bank or the Central Bank of Kenya tracks, and if these people are working and deploying their skills in Kenya. Because my thinking is that no country can ever develop through money, whether it comes from the diaspora or the multilateral organizations. Countries develop because of skills, because of their people, because of ideas. And therefore, when you've got that hemorrhage of your population, you're likely to be stuck in underdevelopment, in inequalities, in poverty for years to come, which why I don't agree with the government's policy of encouraging Kenyans to go abroad, because that will undermine whatever vision, whatever blueprint that this government has. And in fact, it's an admission of dysfunction, that we can't take care of the citizenry, we can outsource that responsibility to somebody else. So, Saddam, even as you celebrate those good monies from the diaspora, the cost is extremely dear. Joki, I'm finishing with you. You talk about Kenya, I think you're referring to Kenya as leader in this region. I'm not so sure. I think our economy is big, and I'm told Ethiopia is breathing heavily down our shoulders. But I don't see us even, flexing our diplomatic muscle regionally. When my former president goes to see the president of Uganda, then my current president also follows suit. I'm not so sure that Kenya is a leader in the region? I'm not so sure. So I think you must be cautious that you don't succumb to what I call Kenyan exceptionalism. There are quite a number of problems that we have to fix before we lead the region.
A bit of philosophy. There is a very restless, Dr. Sembo, if you allow me, there's a very restless hand, which I will allow, and then I now terminate. Yeah, please. Make it bullet precise, not another presentation.
I'm not trained in that fashion, moderator. Ambassador S.K. Maina, I was formerly Kenya's ambassador to Japan. Stayed there just shy of 6 years. And prior to that, I was also director of multilateral affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now, let me start by first of all really appreciating the presenters for their wonderful expose. I think they've done a wonderful job, and the interaction that has been taking place is good. Now, my attention actually goes to Mercy, who I know very well. We used to work with her in the same directorate. And I must commend Mary for Mercy for really coming up with a very innovative proposal. The idea of having a 3D model in negotiations, I think, could be a changer in how multilateral engagement. Now, my question to Mercy, has this model been escalated to another level? Is there anybody pushing the model, say, to within the UN circles as a pilot project, or a governmental entity pushing it so that it can be utilized moving forward? Secondly, we are very aware that member states are very averse to new systems. So when we put this proposal through to the member states of the, say, UN or the climate change conferences, how do you think the reception will be? I thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I think you have 2 minutes. I know there are some hands that are restless, but please allow me. We have another session coming, so allow me, please, that you can be humble. Then we engage in these areas later on. So, Njoki? Just 2 minutes.
All right. No, I keep it short and sweet. So I will thank Professor for the interventions. You and I, as is our tradition, can continue the debate after this. Just to say that even as we talk about the politics of the day, I think we'll also, in terms of its impact on interventions, I think it's important to also acknowledge that politics is local, and that after all is said and done, whether, for instance, and the approach that the government took with respect, for instance, when you're looking at the Kenya-Somali maritime boundary dispute, and even another example with respect to the Lake Victoria, and other disputes that continue to occur, not just between Kenya and other countries, but also other Eastern African countries, you see that and again, when I say politics is local, the people who end up representing us are coming from here. So much so that the approach that we take as a citizenry, and that's why in the circular illustration that I gave, I suggested that it is important that we have a deliberate public engagement and public participation, because it is the one that will call out our politicians and call them to order in terms of certain interventions that we want them to make. Indeed, taking special appreciation of the fact that sometimes, as Professor has highlighted, whatever it is or whoever it is that is representing us may have a political intervention that may not necessarily be good on the ground for Kenyans. So just the fact that if we can empower Kenyans so then they are very deliberate as stakeholders, that will really help. Again, I think I have 30 seconds to go. Just to highlight that our domestic and policy intervention, and even the need and the call for balancing geopolitical tensions, all this, even as again we look at the politics, it's local. We must empower our people so that then, because when you look at the impact with respect to the implementation of the ICJ decisions on boundary disputes, you find that their acceptance on the ground depends on how the people on the ground are going to either appreciate or, recognize or, reject those particular outcomes. So after all is said and done, we may call out our politicians only if we have empowered our people properly, so that then we have common positions as we move forward. Just on the intervention about Kenya being a leader or not, you correctly said that it is a debate that can continue, even though it is important to note that when you look at the various international interests, and even the fact that, as you have highlighted, our former president going to a specific country, our current president going to a specific country, it is actually in recognition of that very critical role that we play. It is important to just look at the various times when Kenya as a country has been called upon to make certain interventions, especially with respect to regional peace and security. And I think that is the very reason why we said it is important that we prioritize amicable resolution of disputes, because given that people are looking up to us, if we don't manage our disputes with other countries properly, then we lose that very position that you have been able to very properly highlight. If we don't handle the positions properly, the disputes properly, then we look like we are bullies, and we are therefore not able to have the buy-in of other countries. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I'll just respond to the question that was directed. As I had mentioned in my presentation, you touch on the very thing that is affecting policymakers in terms of the diaspora. Do we talk about brain drain or do we talk about brain circulation? So you have to acknowledge that majority of the diaspora we're discussing left Kenya within the period of the 80s and the 90s. Of course, there's been a charge in the 2000s, but we know what was going on in Kenya at the time. There are very many opportunities that these people could get out there that were not open to them in Kenya, right? So migration has always been part of the human civilization of our history. And people, even in states where migration is not allowed, people still attempt to migrate, right? No matter what the consequences may be, they take a chance for greener opportunities. So how, as policy makers, as change makers, can we look at something that's going on and decide to use it as an opportunity? I think I'll borrow from what Professor Mnene said. It's all about attitude. So are we choosing to look at these people who go elsewhere for opportunities they can't get here, whether it's academic, economic, health purposes? Do we choose to look at them as an opportunity and the skills that they have gained? True that if they were here, we don't know for certain that they would have achieved what they have achieved there in Kenya. So they have achieved something there. Can we use that to gain? And I do agree that these skills could be very profitable in Kenya. But then again, I think I borrow from Professor Mnene. Are we incentivizing these people to come back, to now help us build so that future generations also don't choose to go out, that they have the opportunity to stay in and get those same opportunities, and then we can grow inwards? So it is a discussion, but I choose to be optimistic and choose to look at it more from a brain circulation standpoint than brain drain.
Yeah, thank you very much. Mercy, if you're online, Mercy, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'll start with the previous speaker, Ambassador Maina. Thank you very much for your kind words and mentorship, and that is why seeing you sitting there is very encouraging. We worked with you very well indeed. On the issue of involvement of the model, I think most of the developing nations, particularly United States of America, is using this model, though they've not expressly stated that this is the model that they're using. And they've been successful in a number of areas, not necessarily in the climate change agenda, but mostly in conflicts and even part of their own business negotiation process. So it's applicable across a broad spectrum of things. And I believe if we employ this 3D negotiation as Africans, it will be more impactful in how we engage and how we get meaningful outcomes out of what we want. In terms of Professor Masharia's, I can't agree more with him in terms of knowledge of the subject matter, and this should span over a long period of time. And knowledge of, number one, the national interest becomes very critical. What is your national interest, even as you go to Committee of States in terms of the negotiation process? Your knowledge on the subject matter becomes very key in terms of the substantive issue, but also what are the interests, who are the actors, what are the issues, how are these issues evolving over and above the period of time. So as a country, in terms of policy, we need to be more deliberate, more intentional in terms of what are the issues that we are going to drive, who are the people going to drive this agenda, how do we do succession management so that even with the exit of people, you have young people again filling in the void, because this is a long process. Almost close to 30 years is a long process that we might be able to monitor what is the process like. How is it changing? Who are the actors? How are the interests evolving over time? Then what do we want as a country? Then even in our involvement within our concentric cycle, who are our allies, who are our anchors, who are our partners? How do we frame our issues in a way that doesn't give threats to people or countries that we would call the would-be allies? So that I find very critical in terms of involvement in the process. Our national interest becomes core, whether it supersedes every other thing. But at what expense? Because more often than not, when you come to the framing of issues, that is where people lose the negotiation process. Because when you frame it in a way that the other parties view it as a threat or a loss in the win-win or win-lose, then there'll be no progress. But again, every nation state or country or groupings have their own, what they are calling their best alternative to a negotiated agreement, but also what they are calling non-negotiables, what is vital to them. So how do we as negotiators understand the deals behind the table, the tactics that they use, and the design that they use to be able to counter the proposals that they give us? So that, to me, I think will be very vital going forward as negotiators for our countries as in terms of policy recommendation. And I can't emphasize more also the role of technology in augmenting and supporting the human activities in the negotiation process. I thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mercy. Professor Kekaya, 2 minutes, please. Professor or Dr. Abdallah, any who is online? Professor?
Professor seems to be offline.
Hey.
Thank you. Just quickly respond to the question of how to integrate the Kenyan diasporans who have long left the country. I think, as has been mentioned by Professor Ambassador Kikaya, is the element of creating awareness and sensitization of these same Kenyan diaspora through our respective Kenya High Commissions abroad. So we usually have the diaspora forums during diaspora meetings, the same narrative of investments and integration with respect to climate change back at home can be kind of re-emphasized to the diaspora and create some sort of a snowballing effect such that the same diaspora can spread the message to the fellow Kenyan diasporans who have not been able to get the opportunity to maybe engage or attend such forums. And also we have our State Department for diaspora affairs. They can also be able to take up to that because in our missions, the missions have a database of those Kenyans who have registered. So this is something that can be taken up and to ensure that those Kenyans who have long lost touch with the missions can be able to be integrated into such climate change endeavors back at home. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, distinguished colleagues. I think she raised something that we need to ponder about. I was in Japan for over 6 years, and there is no Kenyan official who knew I was there, because I was not getting any support from the embassy. So I think we need really to look at diaspora in terms of incentivizing them, recognizing them, and even if they have some challenges, you are alone in some of these foreign countries. So I agree with her. Lejuma is still waiting to see the gender dynamics. So the group that is coming after here, please update your record so that she can be satisfied. I see her there nodding her hand in anger, because we are missing gender. Ladies and gentlemen, let us put one big applause to the all presenters. Thank you very much. Please appreciate me for my good performance. I now hand over power peacefully.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's appreciate the moderators and the presenters for the last session. I request that in the interest of time, we will not have our tea break, but tea is available. Just you can just step out, take a cup, and you can take it from here as we continue, so that we save on time. Our next theme or sub-theme is on transnational organized crime, and Madam Jackie Mbogo, our moderator, is on standby. Please, I hand over the entire session to you. We are in your hands.
Thank you very much. I will start on the established protocols and once again say good morning. Is it good morning? Still morning. My name is Jackie Mbogo. I'm here to facilitate the conversation on climate change and transnational organized crime in East Africa. Now, because I'm standing between you and lunch, I promise you we will do justice to the session, but we'll also be very, very brief. And ladies and gentlemen, recognizing that the pathways from climate change to violence and insecurity is not always very straightforward. So this particular session is one that is aimed to rouse your thoughts to what exactly climate change does in terms of increasing the vulnerabilities to violence, including transnational organized crime. We will also be looking at the impact of climate change on opening the fault lines for violence and insecurity. We'll be looking at those vulnerabilities and the resultant vulnerabilities, because it's multi-layered levels of vulnerability, especially on livelihoods, migration and mobility, armed groups and non-state actors in violence. We'll be looking at how these groups exploit climate change vulnerabilities in communities to make the situation for insecurity worse. We will illustrate the relationship, the long and short and long-term relationships between these particular issues and root causes and dynamics of violence in communities. The critical role of human action and reaction to these particular issues of insecurity. And to do that, ladies and gentlemen, we will be joined by distinguished researchers such as Professor Elijah Munyi, who you will note, ladies and gentlemen. I'll just introduce them so that when we get to talking, it will be very, very quick for us. And so I'll just very briefly look at who Professor Elijah Munyi is. And he's an accomplished associate professor of international relations at the United States International University, which we usually call USIU. Professor is also a notable researcher with a portfolio that covers a range of topics, including foreign and direct investment, international trade law, commercial diplomacy, regional integration, project management and development, and Africa economic relations with China and the EU. The professor has a Doctor of Philosophy in International Relations from Aalborg University in Denmark. He's also an established scholar with dedication to academic excellence that is further underscored by his recognition as a recipient of postdoctoral award at Science at Docks in France, and solidifying his contribution to global academia and international relations. Karibu sana, Professor. so that you can take us through integrating climate-based migration into intelligence estimates and border security in East Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, karibu kiti. Ladies and gentlemen, will also have the presence of the distinguished Dr. Luchetu Likaka, who is an experienced research fellow with a strong dedication to criminal justice research and is currently a consultant at Expertise Criminologique Kenya. He has contributed significantly to publications exploring topics such as cultural dynamics in post-conflict, pastoral conflict among Samburu and Pokot communities in Kenya, as well as implementation of community policing by security agencies in Joro Sub-County, Nakuru, Kenya. He holds a Master's of Science in Criminal Justice Law, Law Enforcement Administration from the University of Stirling, a Master's in Sociology from Egerton University, and postgraduate diploma in Criminal Justice, Police Science from the University of Witwatersrand. Dr. Likaka's education background reflects his commitment, in-depth understanding and analysis of criminal justice. Karibu sana daktari. And finally, for the panel will be Edward Mudhuri, who is a dedicated law-focused recent graduate with a degree in law from African Nazarene University. His academic journey has showcased exceptional analytical skills and profound grasp of legal principles. He's motivated by a strong sense of justice and equality. He envisages creating a positive societal impact through a career as a legal practitioner. Edward's passion extends to environmental law and policies, where he seeks to address the urgent issues presented by climate change. His active involvement in school regarding climate-related conferences reflects his deep commitment, fostering a comprehensive understanding of legal frameworks and potential solutions to addressing this global crisis. Karibu sana, Edward. And again, we need to applaud Edward because he's representing the young generation of actors that are going to make sure that we get it right on this discourse. Karibu sana. And Edward will be looking at climate change, migration, armed conflict in East Africa. And then, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to have reflections from an expert who is Colonel Dr. Charles Okongo Imbiaka. Again, I will introduce him so that we just get going immediately. And he holds a position of head of teaching and curriculum at the National Defense University, Kenya. His extensive academic background includes a PhD in diplomacy and international relations, an MA in armed conflict and peace studies, Bachelor of Arts in Education, majoring in history and government, with a profound focus on military history, strategy, national security, and conflict management. He has a wealth of expertise in teaching, training, and research. His prior roles include being a lecturer and a researcher at the National Defense College, where he played a pivotal role in establishing the National Defense University of Kenya and developing its initial academic program. He is also a spokesman for the African Union Mission in Somalia and contributed to training and material development for female engagement teams. Dr. Imbiaka research contributions are notable, and you will see the number of publications that he has. And he is currently involved in the development of the book KDF, The Defense of the Nation. I really hope it will also include a chapter on gender. His dedication extends to supervising students at various academic levels, reflecting his commitment to education and research in security and military studies. Karibu sana, Colonel Dr. Charles Okongo. And ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to now call upon our distinguished first presenter, who is going to be Professor Elijah Munyi. And Professor, because we are so hungry, climate change, we were told today it's anger and hunger, isn't it? So because we are hungry, we do not want anger to happen in the room. So 10 minutes, please, so that we get ourselves in time for lunch. Karibu sana.
Thank you very much. Is it possible to have the Yeah, so basically what this presentation is trying to do is to ask ourselves, we are all talking about climate. There's so much, climate is now at the center of almost everything. It's at the center of agriculture, decarbonization, security, smart agriculture, health, and so on. It's easy to get confused. So what do we do, especially from security perspective? So what this presentation is basically trying to say is, can we carve out some niche 4 or 5 areas of what we can do to accomplish in the next maybe 10 years or so? So this is a picture taken sometimes in 2020 of what is being called the drowning world of Kenya. So these are Rift Valley lakes that seem to be expanding and sinking a lot. And so from a starting point of what is happening, the question is, what can the security sector do? At least we are now familiar and sure that in terms of security, the biggest threats that we have are floods. Yeah, so we've got floods and we've got displacement, and these have been referred to a couple of times. So these are the 2 main things that security operators have to be thinking about. So from studies, what we do as professors is to rely on existing literature and try to improve it. And we've got some very interesting literature that was written as far back as 2007 by people from Chatham House and the Institute of Climate and Security. And what they did is basically they isolated 5 areas of the nexus between security and climate. And the first one is increased migration and displacement, which has come up. The second one is conflict around the boundaries and shared resources, which has also come up. Ambassador Dr. Monica Juma talked a lot about food and energy security. So that's the third area. Then there's a very interesting one which relates directly to the Rift Valley lakes, which is submerging of installation, security installation, chiefs camps, and probably military installations and so on. And the 5th one is partnerships and finance. So what we are really here for. How does climate change either give us opportunities in the security sector to either take advantage, or how does it displace funding that is available? So essentially, this is just a summary of what is happening. We can expect, just go back a little bit, please. Back. Yes. So we anticipate a lot more displacements. We anticipate more boundary conflicts, and not just boundary, but also internally, in terms of particularly livestock, herders, and so on. As we know, because of climate and what we had in the morning, what Israel is doing very well, agriculture has been coming down, food production is low, so we are importing a lot of food. Issues of food security come up, and food security, food dependency, what Mayor Noran talked about. Then security installations, what happens when chiefs camps and police quarters are flooded? And finally, what can we do about financing? So based on the literature areas of concern, we can anticipate what is going to happen. And therefore, the question is for security operators, how can we respond to these 5 issues? So just some couple of data on displacement, for example, between now and 2050, the Horn of Africa region is expected to get 10.1 million more internal displacements. Now, Kenya and Ethiopia have been the main recipients of these internal displacements from around us. But now we know that Ethiopia already is in crisis. You saw in the news yesterday what has happened to some Ethiopians trying to cross to another place. So we do anticipate Kenya is actually going to be the biggest recipient of these 10.1 million people. How do we anticipate for them? How do we prepare for that? In the last 3 years, Kenya has lost over 2.5 2.5 million cattle due to cattle rustling, conflicts, and so on. All those are caused by resource competition for water and grass. How do we respond to that? One of my favorite is on food security. So these are just figures on how dependent we are on just one country. For example, because we are not producing maize anymore, we depend on one country. I don't know whether you can guess what country that is, but we buy 97% of our maize from them. We buy 48% of our wheat from one country. We buy 46% of our rice imports from one country. Fertilizer is the same. It's moved a little bit this year. And finally, oil, which I think is a good model. Oil is so important for our energy needs, but even actually for oil, it's quite diversified. So we only get 33% of our oil from the biggest importing country. So is it good that we keep our dependency this high in terms of food? Like Solai by 123% in just one decade. And these expansions, Lake Victoria, Naivasha has expanded by 25%. And these expansions have a lot of implications on land, legal issues, food production. Let's move on. So very quickly on recommendations. The recommendations, therefore, are based on each of these 5 pillars. What do we actually need to do? Action, 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 as we've been told. So what I'm suggesting in terms of security, I think we can integrate 3 currently existing databases or indexes. One is IGAD's, the early warning system, which tells us about the rain. And the other 2 are on International Organization of Migration Displacement Tracking Matrix. Now, as a security agents, if we can aggregate these 3, then we are very easily able to anticipate the movements on the 10.1 million people. And more importantly for the security sector is to say, what can we handle? And beyond this amount, whether it's 3 million or 4 million or 1 million, what do we do for the other anticipated? So I think this is an action point we can take. Next. On shared resources and expected increases in conflict along boundaries, I think the most important thing is to work as the security sector with the international NGOs and civil society sectors, because they're the ones who are doing a lot of the community level trust building. I think we need to do that continuously, on a continuous basis, to anticipate not when the cattle rustling comes up, but to do it as a continuous activity. So we need to factor how security sector integrates better the work of civil societies in what the security sector is doing. Next, on food security, the proposal is to build our own national food security index, and that's not so difficult, which is going to be driven by the security sector assessment of both our food security as well as our food dependency. So the proposal here is to build a food security index that is going to be ran from the security agencies to inform the ministries of trade and agriculture and so on, especially to reduce our food dependency and food insecurity arising from importation. My suggestion would be that we should not be importing more than 33% of our food from any one single country, because they can hold us ransom. Next. Yeah, let's map and budget for possible physical changes to anticipate the movements in the lakes in cases of movements of installation or displacements of staff and things like that. And finally, I think the most interesting one is partnership and finances. So one of the things that I think I would commend the security sector in the country is that in 2021, they commissioned a very nice report, small report, which was based on the what to do about the Rift Valley lakes. And that report came up with this 17 billion shillings figure, which I think is the figure that we should get out of here with, to say this is, and in terms of developing the discourse of security, financing, and climate, we've got already a figure of the 17 billion, which we can actually claim and take to the climate summit and say this is the figure that we want domiciled at the security in order to deal with the mitigation and adaptation. So in terms of financing, I think we've got a tentative figure, and the most important thing with that financing, I think, would be to take out that report and implement it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think you've raised very, very important issues. Kenya is not expanding, but if we have to receive 10 million parcels, what does that mean for us and the pressure that we already have? I've also taken from you the need to diversify. It's risky to source all our food from one person, because if they are also threatened by climate changes, then we are also in the same boat. We will starve. Thank you so much. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we move it forward, and we have Dr. Luchetu, who will be talking about climate change and organized crime in Eastern Africa. And what he's answering is, what is the way forward? Karibu sana. 10 minutes, please.
All protocols observed. Good afternoon. Allow me to engage you slightly without figures, but to raise a lot of sentiments that I've captured in my paper. Indeed, looking at the issues of organized crime and climate change. We are finding ourselves at the peril of the two, at the background of huge challenge in terms of our population growth, particularly for the youth, advancement in technology, and the vulnerability that has posed the challenge in terms of scarcity and the rule of law. Then why is it a concern? You could move the slides. Indeed, we are all aware of our wildlife and the challenges we face around these trophies, all the way from Tanzania, with the expansiveness of Tanzania, and the challenge in terms of that relationship with Mozambique, from Uganda, from DRC, the chimpanzees and the baboons, and the reptiles that have got a good market in China. All these are some of the challenges we face. And our saddlewood back home here. The illegal logging, the challenges in terms of the drugs and the coastline that we are facing. Our central role as Kenya in terms of the geopolitics and the participation in the drug networks running all the way from South America to our coastline and also to India and South Africa. The trend continues in terms of Kenya being the source, the destination, and also a transit point in terms of human trafficking. A number of Burundians, Rwandans coming through here. All of us moving all the way to the other countries, and the networks and the criminal gangs along the way that actually are going to the extent that actually they recruit and transfer these human beings across. And they are all to the point where you find today, even with number of legislations in Uganda and also in Kenya, we have actually kind of legalized the trade because we register these recruiting companies. But what do they do at the end of the day? Are we able to monitor? Then the technology comes in. Everybody else is moving closely around our region. If you look at the number of migrants who have come in, settling in Nairobi, just because we are advancing technology, then how are they taking advantage of this technology in perpetration of those crimes? I've also gone ahead to look at issues of money laundering, and particularly in facilitation of this. And we have all these debates around monies that came in or are coming in from Al-Shabaab that comes and finds their way into our economy. How do we actually clean these monies and ensure that they are part and parcel of our economy? How are we able even to manage now that we're even increasing the floats in terms of what we are actually supposed to transact. What is the intersection? The evidence is indeed clear that we have the vulnerability on the basis of the scarcity of the resources, the competing interests, and the fact that you have to plan yourself in a manner that can help you to survive, and therefore providing a good opportunity for many people to get organized. Interesting with organized crime is actually done very well by people in suits. They are not gangs that are actually based out there, but they are just people looking like us, sitting down and planning ahead, being able to bypass the system. But then how do you bypass the system? You need actually to take advantage of the weak laws. You need to take advantage of the weak systems. That is the only way you are able actually to perpetuate this. And that goes into the element of deficit in terms of our trust in our criminal justice system. That indeed, how will you find that a product all the way from Tanzania finds its way to Kenya, and then it's used to prepare illicit brews that kill several Kenyans here? So these are issues that you find, the issue of trust within our criminal justice system, then exacerbating the whole thing in terms of the economy. Security challenges. Indeed, are we really ready, or have we really trained our security officers to respond to the changing dynamics within organized crime and the changing climatic conditions? The persistent conflicts. If you look at the Karamoja region, look at the northern part of Kenya. What is happening in relation to conflict induced by the challenges of climate? Then are we able to respond that? But then the intersection here, then the intra-community conflicts. That again, another major challenge. Environment. The destruction of the biodiversity brings consistent competition, meaning you have to organize yourself to bypass the system for you to be able to make both ends meet. I've talked about vulnerability and migration. The major challenge around here is, a few years ago we are saying, yes, we were colonized, but these days we are equally taking ourselves to the colonialists. What is happening at home that we are not able to take care of ourselves, that indeed we will take advantage and say, let us continue sending more and more Kenyans in diaspora. But what are they going through in Saudi Arabia and among others? Those are the challenges that what mechanism, because the ones recruiting them and taking advantage of that. This is actually the bone to chew, the rule of law. Indeed, you cannot participate in organized crime without having a collaboration with those ones in power, particularly the political leadership and the security agencies. This is where our recommendation should lie. Indeed, if we really don't address this, then organized crime remains our major challenge. Communities back on the ground have a lot of problems. Are we going to be protecting community land, for instance, or are we going to help those communities cope with the changes and also the fact that the land grabbers are taking their land? What are we going to do? How are you going to ensure that actually we take care of the relationship in terms of that scarcity and the issue of crime and the issue of conflict, which is actually going to be the new normal in terms of conflicts in the region? What about the root causes? Indeed, we need to appreciate that we will just go beyond the normal policy discussions here, that we have come up with practical actions that can actually address the problem on the ground. These strategies that are supposed to address the root causes then must actually be community informed, because this is where the major challenge comes. Then are our solutions community-based, or are they informed by the senior government officials or those ones at the higher level that decide for the local community? And therefore, I'll beg to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daktari. That was very well put. And thank you for observing time, even Professor. Our panel is doing very well for time. So I've taken from you the big connection between the vulnerabilities to our fragilities within Kenya and the region, and the transactional interests that make this trade profitable and easy. I've also taken from you the need to build resiliency to these fragilities. So the question I think we will continue to ask ourselves, how do we bounce back? How do we build resiliency? How do we fortify our communities so that then they don't become too vulnerable? But taking us forward will be Edward Mudhuri, who will be looking at climate change, migration and armed conflict in East Africa. And ladies and gentlemen, you can see it's building onto each other as we try to solidify this case for why we must address climate change so that we reduce insecurity in our region. Karibu sana, you have 10 minutes.
All protocols observed. Good afternoon. Unfortunately, I did not have the slides, but I'm going to take a short time to point out and explain the key main. Climate conflict by considering the effects of climate change to be both local and national in character. And I draw on an East African conflict database that includes violent incidents. The effects of climate change jeopardize food security and the lives of affected communities. To begin, there are several sorts of conflict, the most prominent of which being armed conflict between the state and rebel groups, and the other being non-state conflict between communities such as herders and farmers. This basically means that increased resource rivalry can lead to violent conflict within communities in specific circumstances. Eastern Africa, which is vulnerable to climate change, suffers from and even armed confrontations are on the rise. This has far-reaching implications for human security since it creates displacements and pushes vast numbers of people to migrate in search of safety and food. Climate change-related mass migration complicates border security in Eastern Africa. The movement of huge numbers of individuals across permeable borders puts governments' ability to control and regulate these movements under strain. This, in turn, raises security concerns because illegal activities like human trafficking and arms smuggling can thrive in such environments. Climate change is also exacerbating cattle rustling, a long-standing problem in the region. Due to lack of grazing land and economic pressures, communities resort to livestock theft as a means of survival. Cattle rustling not only causes intercommunal conflict, but it also funds criminal networks and fuels regional violence. I've also talked about ways of countering violent extremism in Eastern Africa, one of them being intervention of the educational sector. Detection and prevention of extremism through educational institutions such as primary and secondary schools, colleges, and universities. A series of activities to guarantee that extremists do not utilize educational institutions to radicalize and recruit for violence. These steps will include ensuring that all private and public schools follow a common state-approved curriculum and encouraging initiatives that teach respect for diversity. Furthermore, partnerships should be formed to facilitate teacher training in identifying early warning signs of potential radicalization among students, as well as to develop relationships between schools, communities, and local police to guarantee that staff and students' concerns may be discussed with trusted authorities. The other method is empowering women and gender. Recognizing the gender dynamics of violent extremism will result in the establishment of a gender forum to engage women leaders, unions, and civil society organizations working with girls and women in the implementation of community-level programs to prevent and fight radicalization. It will hold workshops to give leadership development, mediation, and conflict resolution skills, as well as to build existing women's networks and groups to engage in activities to lessen the possibility of radicalization to violence. Women will be engaged and empowered to be key partners in strengthening communities' resolve to resist radicalization and recruitment to violence, recognizing that women's perceptions and experiences of violent extremism may differ from those of men in the communities. And lastly, the policy recommendations. I think by following the
by following the steps noted here to be taken to make societies more resilient to violent conflict exacerbated or even provoked by climate change. The first one being increasing of food security by stockpiling reserves and keeping prices consistent during droughts. The second one is encouraging economic diversity inside and beyond the agricultural sector, for example, by giving targeted assistance and finance small-scale farmers. The third one is increasing state capability and establish specific government entities to give similar amounts of assistance to herders and pastoralists affected by climate change. The fourth one is to invest more in research on the mechanisms that link climate and conflict in affected communities, as well as knowledge transfer to aid in the development of methods for resolving climate-related conflicts. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much. I think you've posed in my mind a very important challenge that if we can reduce vulnerabilities to climate change, why would we not reduce vulnerability to violence? You've also talked about the place of inclusion, especially women in decision-making and prevention. Thank you so much for speaking and voicing for women, and I'm sure Madam Commissioner will be applauding that. Thank you very much. And I take back my threat about time. You've actually gone ahead of me and saved us a lot of time. Asante sana. Now we move on to the reflections by Kano Dr. Charles Imbiaha. I must tell you, Kano told me to pronounce his name well because I was calling it differently. So now I have practiced in the last 40 minutes. Imbiaha.
Distinguished participants, allow me to also rise on the existing protocols, but also allow me, so that I'm not crucified, to recognize the presence of my mentors in this house, particularly Ambassador General Njoroge, there's the Executive Director, Brigadier retired Dr. Kabage, there's Colonel Dr. Handa, and a myriad of other military experts from the security sector in this room. As earlier introduced, I'm Colonel Dr. Charles Imbiaha, and I'll not do the reflection the professor way. I will do it the NDUK way, the National Defense University Kenya way, so that I don't become so senior when my seniors are here. Our first presenter talked about climate change. Climate change, integrating climate change into national security. Very elaborate, and because I've read the paper, I'll only emphasize what I thought could enrich the paper. Professor Munyi, you well touched on the SDGs. You well touched on scholars like Barry Busan. However, in the security sector, we emphasize the conceptual framework Barry Busan brings to the fore, where the end state of understanding national security boils into human security. And at the helm is the political security. We have now information security, which fits very well into the theme of this conference. We have economic security and health security. Then lately, we are bringing in the societal security, in which we are moving beyond the whole of government approach to national security to include the whole of society approach to national security or security issues. And therefore, when we are emphasizing all the aspects of security, then we need to see where whole of society approach to security comes in. And when we look at this, then we are able to talk to the Wanjiku and Wanjiru and Teresinas in the villages, so that we are able then to think about their levels of vulnerability and resilience. Again, we all, in the three presentations, there is a key element which Professor Munene brought out, the political element. For example, when you're talking about organized crime, and I think Chetu talked about it, that crime must be organized. What one of the professors, Professor Alex Diwal, talks of the real politics, in his book, The Real Politics of the Horn of Africa, Money, War, and the Business of Power. He talks about the political marketplace and how the politicians will want to organize this marketplace to garner support. And so, in this marketplace, loyalties are tradable. We trade loyalties for rewards. And there's no crime that can flourish without this kind of organization. Then, as you mentioned, you went ahead to suggest, to propose what the security sector would want to do. I challenge you that we are already doing what you're proposing. So it is important, therefore, that you come down to some of the experts I've mentioned to understand what the security sector is doing for us then to invoke any other additional frameworks or understandings. Climate change, migration, armed conflict in East Africa. A well-put topic. But there are statistics that are available that we need to bring to the fore that makes this look like a problem that the government should be able to address, or the security sector should be able to address. We are told in 2021, there were reported cases of conflicts within the region. And all these reports were either high intensity or low intensity. And all the countries in the East African region were affected by this. So you are either in it or you are affecting, and the ripple effect goes to the other countries. This is a missing aspect that we should be able to look at. How does the conflict in our neighboring state affect us as Kenya? Or how would conflict in Kenya affect a neighboring state to Kenya? So if we concentrate on the flow into Kenya, we should also be seeing at what happens from the place of origin of these migrations. Again, at the Ministry of Defense, in the security sector, we are emphasizing education. Seemingly nobody is bothered about talking about education in terms of climate change. We are aware that the current Kenyan National Examination Council, Agriculture Practical, is on tree planting. And this is not a secret. This is something we should applaud the Kenya National Examination Council towards the issue of climate change. Particularly when we look at the number of candidates, 740,000 plus candidates are planting each 20 trees. What is the ripple effect? Those are the things we should be able to bring out so that our discussions are tangible. We have what we call the National Defense University Kenya. As we discuss this and say, what is the security sector doing? Do we even understand how this is focused to solve some of these crises and the disaster issues within the region? Then, as we make our recommendations, particularly for us in the security sector, we expect somebody to be more clearer and tell us this is what you've been doing and this is how we want you to do it better. But if you recommend that the security sector should enhance security over the border, then you have not helped us. Please come out and tell us this is exactly what we want you to do. Particularly at the level of academia, I'm sure you can point out anything without fear or favor. And then finally, as I draw towards the end, all the presentations again, particularly when you're looking at armed conflict, it is important for us to look at the key players in armed conflicts. All the way from the political to those who are vulnerable. And therefore, I will agree with Commissioner, what was the name again? Dichuma, that is a missing link. Because when there are conflicts, the most affected people are children and women. And the entirety of the spectrum of conflict should come out very clearly. In Somalia, an experience is we would see a real difference in the way the conflict is being handled by engaging women in what they call the female engagement teams. They are very effective, and even in climate change, we need to come out very clearly and always bring in the issue of gender. Thank you so much. I rest my case.
Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard, we rest our case. But as precedence was set, just before we go for lunch, I'll just take 2 questions only. Comment or question very, very quickly, then we can bring the session to a close. Okay, I will go to the gentleman and allow me to be biased and go to Commissioner, please. And I'm sorry to this side, I didn't see a hand, or was I biased already? But we have that side and the lady.
Okay, my name is Jacob Mwanduka, and I would like to comment on very basic level about food security. As a family, go out there, bring your children who are in Nairobi and other towns, discuss how you are going to improve from 2 bags of maize to 10. That will solve the family food problem, the village, and up to the national level. Floods. I've worked in and out around Lake Nakuru. Every year, Lake Nakuru receives 50 tons of seed loads simply because we have opened the upper catchment. We need to employ soil conservation structures, and we need to do practical things on the ground. Rangers and the offices of Lake Nakuru National Park have been submerged, and there's a huge problem. The other thing is about family sizes. People who live around Lake Nakuru National Park, for example, they have between 2 to 5 acres, and the family sizes range between 9 to 15. A huge problem. Then the other thing I would like to comment about is what happened. We had the national slogans. Mzee alisema turudi mashambani, hakuna cha bure. Mzee Moi said peace, love, and unity. From that time, we went silent. What is this slogan which is going to unify the people of this great country? Thank you.
Okay, a quick one, good presentations. The first presenter on food security. I wish to add a recommendation: invest in local communities. Just invest in local communities. We don't even need to move from Nairobi to go back home. They're there, but they just lack the skills on how to adapt. They see rains coming in March instead of January or February, and nobody tells them why. I miss those days when we were in school and there used to be Francis Ngwata, who would come on the KBC TV to say, today there will be rain, and indeed it rains. But today they say it rains and it doesn't rain. So we need to invest in the local communities. Think about the indigenous food, the maweles, the whatever that are drought resistant, and then begin to educate our people that that is still food, we can eat it. Thank you.
I think most of them were comments. I don't recall hearing a question unless I missed out. Yeah, they were mainly comments. Yeah. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for according us an opportunity to speak about this very, very important topic. I think at a personal level, I have taken away 3 points. The vulnerability to climate change is a driver to the vulnerability to insecurity and armed conflict. We all can agree to that. We've also heard that community resilience is built upon inclusion. It's all of society, not one person, not the elite, not the educators, but the entire society, especially youth and women and indigenous communities. I've also heard a call to action to climate change mitigation must endeavor to include a call to action against the threats to peace and security. If we have no peace and security, we perish. If climate continues to be a challenge, we perish. So we must think about the two together and not separate. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I kindly request that you applaud the very honorable speakers who have done great justice to this session. And I also wish for you to applaud us in a very big way. We kept time. We went under an hour. Excellent for us. Thank you so much. And now I want to hand over to Dr. Asembo so that he can guide us on the next steps. Thank you, sirs. You may take your seats.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Another round of applause to Jackie and the team. We know that it is lunchtime and we don't want to spend any more time here. We request that we kindly move down to the restaurant for lunch. We still intend to have our next session begin at 2, which means we have around 40 to 45 minutes for lunch. So let's try as much as possible to squeeze our lunch within that time and then come back here at exactly 2. We have some lunch tickets down at the restaurant. Please just pick them as you walk in. We thank you very much for being with us up to this particular time. We have an interesting session in the afternoon. Please don't miss it. Thank you very much and welcome for lunch.